Now, new data reveals a growing number of people are turning away from what you're watching now. That is the news, of course. According to the report by the Reuters Institute, a record high 39% of people worldwide say they sometimes or often actively avoid the news. That's compared with 29% back in 2017. Looking just at the United Kingdom, almost 3/4 of people said they get their news online, compared with 50% for TV and just 14% for print. Well, let's speak to Nick Newman, Senior Research Associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and lead author of this report. Thank you very much for joining us, Nick. And you do these reports every year. Just tell us more about what you're finding here.
I think we're seeing a lot of change, a lot of increased complexity in the media landscape around the world. So online, social media, competing for people's attention. And sort of one of the consequences of that is that people are feeling a bit overwhelmed and confused by all these different sources. So I think that's part of the story. And as you say, almost 4 in 10 say that they sometimes or often avoid the news. So that's not to say they're not consuming the news, but maybe they're trying to protect themselves from the depressing news agenda. We've just been hearing about, Gaza and the war in the Middle East and Ukraine. So some of these things are playing into it, as well as, the cost of living crisis, COVID that came before. So there's a lot of factors at play here, I think, as well as sort of just disillusion with politics in the sense that there's nothing that people can do to change things. So why bother keeping up with the news? I think that's something we hear a lot when we talk to respondents.
And just tell us more in detail about what you found in terms of where people are willing to consume news.
Well, I mean, people are still consuming news in huge numbers. It's incredibly important for all kinds of reasons. It's a year of enormous elections, and the basic trends are that people are consuming what you might call traditional media less, so television news, sort of linear television news, and print and radio, and that they are consuming digitally more. Or, in fact, we find that they're not really consuming news digitally more at all, and many of people are disconnecting. So online is quite flat. And that's really the challenge for traditional media companies and for societies and democracies, actually, is sort of informing people in this very fragmented landscape where, you could be consuming something very short from TikTok or in social media, but you're not sure whether it's true or not. And I think that's going to become an increasing issue in the sort of era of AI that we're moving into.
And so which areas, I mean, is there anything to learn in terms of what is working? If you're journalists and policymakers and you want to get news out, where are the success stories?
I mean, different kinds of success stories. So in terms of paying for news, you've all heard about the success of the New York Times, which has invested in journalism. It's getting people to pay for journalism, and it's doing really well, hoovering a lot of those subscriptions in the United States. So upmarket newspapers who are essentially selling a product to people who can afford to pay for news and who are seriously interested in news, that's working. You're also seeing a lot of digital niche brands that have particular expertise in an area, who are making connections, sometimes for money, sometimes not for money. I think that's a really interesting bright spot. We're seeing an explosion in podcasting and different formats. Short form video is another thing that consumers are really interacting with much more, and we talk about that a lot in the report. Though sometimes it's not traditional brands like the BBC, but it's young influencers who are getting more traction, even when we're talking about important stories like Gaza.
And just briefly, Nick, in terms of the youth demographic, the socioeconomic differences, what are you finding?
Well, we're finding that young people are different. I mean, they're digital first, but they're social first, and that makes a huge difference. They want news to be participatory. They want to interact with people. It's not just telling the news, but it's actually talking about the news as well. And across the whole international sample, 42% of 18 to 24, so these Gen Zs who grew up with social media, say that social media is now their main source of news, and that raises a whole load of questions about what information they're getting, the transparency of the platforms, and all the rest of it.
Okay, Nick Newman, always great to talk to you and to read your work every year as we look at it. Thank you so much. We'll try not to feel too downbeat here on traditional linear TV, and hope that everyone keeps watching us for a while to come. Thank you so much there. Nick Newman there from the Reuters Institute.